Okay, Masechta Beya, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. Here we go. Weiter discussing the halachas of what we're allowed or not allowed to do on Yom Tov. Maybe Kadayayin Mimakom Lomakom. As we learned in the previous parak, the Chachamim asked certain malachas on Yom Tov because they resemble weekday activities, and doing them on Yom Tov will make it seem like an ordinary day. So this Mishnah gives two more examples. Maybe Kadayayin Mimakom Lomakom Le'Yavim B'Sala B'Kupa. One who brings jugs of wine from place to place in Yom Tov and not bring them in a basket or in a box, even if it's not full. Since a basket or a box is usually used to carry a large quantity of wine, he appears to be carrying a heavy burden, which is a tircha, which is kamasa chol. Abel maybe he'll aksefa elofanu, but he may bring jugs of wine on his shoulder or hold them in his hands before him, because that's how one usually carries small quantities of wine, and thus does not resemble a weekday activity. People used big baskets and boxes to carry 3 or more jugs of wine, but they would use their hands or shoulders to carry a smaller number of jugs. Since the problem here is the appearance of weekday activity, we're concerned with how one carries the wine and not necessarily with the number of jugs one carries. A person may not carry even one jug in a basket or box, but he may carry many jugs by hand or on his shoulder. Similarly, one who carries a box of straw may not sling the box over his back to carry it, because he would appear to be carrying a large amount or preparing to travel in a long way, which would be a malacha of doing a weekday activity. He may carry it in his hand. The Mishnah brings another halacha about the use of straw on Yom Tov. This halacha is the first of many in this parak that are based on the rule of muktzah, which is something that cannot be used on Shabbos or Yom Tov, and it's also midrabbanan to be moved, which we discussed in the Hakdama, understanding the exact concept of muktzah and where it comes from and how it plays out. We may begin taking stalks from a new pile of straw, even though the owner had not planned before Yom Tov to use the straw on Yom Tov. There's a basic machlekes tanoim about the definition of muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda holds that any object that the owner did not plan or expect to use on Shabbos or Yom Tov is considered to be muktzah and is asur. Reb Shimon is more mekel, and he holds that as long as something is fit for use, it's not considered muktzah unless the owner decided not to use it. So if the owner had no plans to use a particular object, but he had nothing against using it, so it's muktzah according to Reb Yehuda, but would be mutter according to Reb Shimon. The Tan of our Mishnah follows Reb Shimon's view. He paskins, therefore, that since the straw is usable, it's not muktzah even though the owner had not planned to use it on Yom Tov. This is not, however, the view taken, the shita of the halachas that are mentioned later on in the parak. But he may not begin taking lumber that's in his backyard, in a backyard storage area, and use it to fuel a fire. This wood is intended not for use that's permitted on Yom Tov, like firewood, but for construction, which is also on Yom Tov and is therefore muktzah. The Mishnah refers to large beams of cedar wood that are valuable, and which the owner does not allow to be used for anything besides their intended purpose, which is construction. As such, they come under the category of muktzah, machim as chesar and kis, which is asur even according to the Tana of our Mishnah. However, if the owner had already began to take this lumber for firewood before Yom Tov, he has shown that he does plan to use it for this purpose and is therefore not muktzah. Mishnah Beis. Ein noitlin eitzim min asukah ela min asamuchla. We may not detach wood from a hut on Yom Tov, because that falls under the malacha of soiser. Detaching wood from a structure demolishes part of the structure, and it's also under the malacha of soiser. The word sukkah here refers to any kind of hut and not specific to the sukkah for Yom Tov. The is an issue with the sukkah on Yom Tov because the sukkah is also kol shiva. That's the Gemara says in that test in sukkah. So it's kodesh l'Hashem in a sense, and it can't be used. It's muktzah, and even some of the decorations would be muktzah, even on Chol Hamoed, as we discussed back then in Masechta Sukkah. So mevin eitzim min asodim l'machunas. Oh, but he is allowed to take wood that's next to the hut and it's not attached to it. The walls of the hut were commonly made of interwoven reeds or pieces of wood. One may take wood that's not woven into the walls, but is standing next to them. Since this wood is not attached to the walls, removing it is not considered soiser. Removing something is not soiser. If you're demolishing something, that's considered soiser, which needs to have a better gather. But if we Mr. Shemler in the Gemara and Haboina, we'll get to a greater clarification of that, and hopefully we'll get there soon. Generally, wood is muktzah unless it was intended to be used on Yom Tov, which is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So we may bring wood from a field only if it's from a pile that the owner gathered before Yantif. That's min hamechunos, what was gathered together before Yantif. By gathering it, he shows that he intended to use it in Yantif, so it's not muktzah. And you may bring wood from an enclosure even if it's scattered and not gathered. The karfef that's discussed over here is a safe place where one would keep things that he intends to use in Yantif. Therefore, even if the wood in the enclosure is scattered, it is not muktzah. Correct, the Mishnah Ezu karfef, what's considered an enclosure in this context? Kol shesamach le'ir, an enclosed area that has a lock and key and is near the town, which means that it's within 70 2/3 amos of the town. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol shenichnasim le b'peisachas, afilu b'seich divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol shenichnasim le b'peisachas, afilu b'seich tchum Shabbos. Any enclosure that has a lock and must be entered with the key does not need to be near the town. Rather, the halacha of a karfef applies even if it's anywhere within the tchum Shabbos, which is a 2,000 amma limit for travel on Shabbos and Yantif, which we discussed in Masechta Eruvin. It's usher to travel on Shabbos and Yantif more than 2,000 amas from one's town or other place of residence. This limit is called the Tchum Shabbos, the Shabbos boundary. Rabbi Yossi holds that if it has a lock and key, it's considered an adequate enclosure in regard to the halacha of the Mishnah, even if it's up to 2,000 amas from the town. However, if it does not have a lock and key, he agrees that it must be near the town. So the machlekes is like this. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the enclosed area must have two conditions. It has to have a lock and key, and it has to be near the town. Rabbi Yossi paskins the one condition is enough. It has a lock and key, or it is near the town. You don't have to have both. Mishnah Gimel. Ein mevaken etzem leimin akeiros leimin akeirish nishbra b'yantif. We may not chop wood from construction beams in order to obtain firewood, and not even from a construction beam that broke on yantif, since the beams were intended for use in construction and are too valuable for firewood. They're muktzah, and again it would be muktzah machmas chisorin case. Moreover, even if a construction beam broke on yantiv and can now be used only for firewood, it remains muktzah. Since it broke on yantiv and was muktzah when yantiv began, it remains muktzah throughout the yantiv. The halacha is that if something was muktzah when Shabbos and yantiv started, it remains muktzah for the entire Shabbos and yantiv, even if the reason why it was muktzah no longer applies. In our case, the beam was muktzah when yantiv began because it was intended at that point to be used for construction. Therefore, even after it breaks, it can no longer be used for construction. It remains muktzah. This halacha is called Migud Iskatzoi Ben Hashmashas Iskatzoi Lakuli Yoima. Since it was muktzah Ben Hashmashas when Shabbos and Yantif began, it's muktzah for the entire day. The term Ben Hashmashas obviously refers to the period between the end of the day and the beginning of the night, and that's when the dinim of muktzah are chal. If such wood broke before Yantif, it may be used on Yantif. However, there are restrictions on the tools one may use. You may not chop the wood with an axe, that's a kardon, v'leba megera or a saw, v'leba magal or with a sickle. A sickle was a curved blade normally used for cutting stalks of grain. Because these are tools used by craftsmen to do forbidden malacha, one who uses them seems to be being mechal yantiv. El kaifetz. One may chop wood only with a cleaver, which is not a craftsman's tool. A kaifetz is a type of knife used by butchers for chopping meat, but it's often found in homes as well, and not specifically a craftsman's tool. If there's a house filled with produce and was sealed before Yantif began, bricks were piled up at its entrance by it, and the wall broke open on Yantif, one may take fruit from the place of the breach in the wall. Although the produce was not accessible when Yantif started, it was not considered muktzah even at that point, because a person could remove the bricks and open the room without doing a malacha. Even a non-muktzah item, such as food, is considered muktzah if it cannot be obtained without doing a malacha. This type of muktzah is called muktzah machmas iser. However, if one would need to be over only the rabbanon to get it, it's not muktzah. The house discussed here was sealed by a pile of bricks that was not cemented together, so breaking it open would break open such a weak wall would only be iser rabbanon. Since one could access the produce in the house by committing no more than just the iser rabbanon, the produce would not be considered muktzah. So nitol mimakam apchas, one may take produce in the place of the breach. So the isra of muktzah does not apply to the peiros because it's only a isra midrabanan. Rameir says one may even open the room in the first place by removing bricks from the opening and take the produce. Since the bricks were merely piled one on top of the other, they were not cemented together. It's mutter to remove them in order to get the produce. As you mentioned before, breaking open this wall is also only midrabanan. Rameir holds that one may be over such a isra drabanan in order to obtain food, because that would be nichlal in oichel nefesh. The Tanakama, however, holds that the malach of seiser, even when it applies only midrabanan, is not lifted for oichel nefesh. Mishnah Daled, ein person es haner. It's also to make a keli, a term that's used here to refer to any object made to serve a specific purpose on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Making a utensil, making a keli, is also from the malacha of makeh b'patish. So the Mishnah brings some malachas that are also for this reason. In person es haner mevnei shu oiseh keli. You may not hollow out a lump of clay to form a lamp. One may not press his fist into a lump of clay to hollow it out, because one thereby makes it a utensil. And you may not make charcoal on Yom Tov, because even charcoal is considered a kli. Charcoal is considered a utensil because it was used as such by goldsmiths when they purified gold. And you may not cut a wick in two, because a new wick is formed. A wick is regarded as a utensil because it uses to hold the flame. The Mishnah brings another Tana that holds that it's mutter to cut a wick into two. Rabbi Yehuda says one may cut it with the flame so that the end of the wick can be used in two lamps. That is, a person may take a single long wick, put one end into one lamp and the other end into another lamp, and light the middle of the wick, so that it splits into two shorter ones. He's allowed to do this because it appears as though he's simply lighting the wick, which would be something that would be mutter on Yom Tov. Mishnah Hey. You may not break a piece of earthenware or cut a piece of paper to form a pad on which to roast a salted fish. When roasting fish on a metal grill, a piece of earthenware or oil-soaked paper would be placed between the fish and the metal, so the hot metal doesn't burn the fish. Although it's mutter to roast a fish on Yom Tov, you may not make a pad to roast to help roast it for this purpose. So making the earthenware or paper fit for this use is considered a malacha. In Gorfen Taner v'Kirayim Aval Mechabshin. You may not shovel out pieces of plaster that fell into an oven or a stove, because that's being misakin. Ovens and stoves were plastered on the inside, so it wasn't unusual for pieces of plaster to fall to the oven floor and get in the way of cooking. So removing the fallen plaster is also on Yom Tov because it repairs the oven or stove by making it fully usable again. Although malacha is generally permitted on Yom Tov in order for taking care of oichel nefesh, these malachas are also because they're not part of the actual food, but merely steps taken to make the food preparation possible, which is machshirei oichel nefesh, preliminary activities for preparing the food. So there's a machlekes tanam whether such steps are mutter on Yom Tov or not, as we spoke in the previous parak, Mishnah Zayin. And the Tana of our Mishnah holds with those who rule that they are asur. The Mishnah here refers to a case where the plaster gets in the way of cooking but does not prevent it completely. In a case where due to the plaster one cannot cook at all, then the Chachamim lifted the Yisr and Ramatir, removing the plaster. But one may press down ashes or dirt that are on the floor of the oven, because that's not considered a repair of the oven. They would, in the times of the Mishnah, bread would be baked by pasting dough to the inside of the oven walls. If hot dirt or ashes gathered on the oven floor, they would have to be pressed down so that they don't touch the bread and burn it. You may not place two barrels near each other in order to set up a pot upon them to use as a makeshift stove, because doing so resembles the malacha of binyan. A fire would be lit between the two barrels and cook with food in the pot. This stove is like a building, and the pot has the roof, and the barrels has the walls, so doing this on Yom Tov would be asur. One may not support an unbalanced pot with a piece of wood on Yom Tov, because wood is muktzah for any use besides for firewood. According to this Tana, wood that was prepared to use on Yom Tov as firewood is assumed to be prepared only for that purpose and no other purpose. So you can't use it to balance a pot. And for the same reason, one may not use a piece of wood to support a door on Yom Tov. You will not drive an animal with a stick on Yom Tov, because it would then appear to be taking it to the market, which is asur on Yom Tov. A stick was usually used to drive an animal when it was going a long distance, such as to the market. The Mishnah refers here to a stick that's not muktzah, because one had intended before Yom Tov to use it for this purpose. However, Reb Shimon holds that it's mutter, because in his view, it doesn't give off this kind of issue of marasayin, that he's taking it lechinga to the marketplace. Mishnah Vav. Rabbi Lezer Omer, another machlekes about using wood on Yontif. Rabbi Lezer Omer, noitel adam kesem yishalafonav lachtis beishinov. A person may take a sliver of wood from slivers that are before him, which means in his house, and pick his teeth. Wood that's in the house is not muktzah and may be used for any purpose. In truth, Rabbi Lezer's matter, a person to use even the wood that's in his yard, like he's going to say in the next line of the Mishnah. The Mishnah specifies before him, which means in the house, to stress that the Chachamim who argue with Rabbi Lezer aser even wood that's in the house to be used to pick one's teeth. Moreover, he may even gather slivers of wood from his yard and light a fire with them or use them for any purpose, because everything that's in the yard too is considered prepared for Yantif and is not considered muksa. The Chachamim say, one may gather slivers of wood only from what's before him in the house, and he may use them only to light a fire. He may not, however, gather them from the yard, because slivers that are scattered in the yard are not considered min hamuchan. Since the slivers of wood are small objects, gathering them requires effort, and would end up being a tircha, even if it's in his chatzar, and it won't be considered min hamuchan, it will still be considered muktzah. So larger pieces of wood, however, which are easy to collect, are not muktzah, even if they're in the chatzar. Nor may he use slivers or large pieces of wood that are in his house for any purpose other than firewood. The Chacham argue with Rabbi Lezer on 2 points. Rabbi Lezer's matter a person to gather small pieces of wood from his yard and use them for any purpose, but the Chacham hold no. The Chacham hold that small pieces of wood of one's yard are completely muktzah, and one may not be used even to light a fire. And number 2, even slivers or large pieces of wood that are in one's house and have been prepared for use as firewood may only be used for that purpose. The Chachamim agree with the Tana of the previous Mishnah, who said that wood is assumed to be prepared only for lighting a fire in Yontif and is muktzah for any other use. Okay, Mishnah Zayin. Ein meitzin se'or, v'loy min ha'etzim, v'loy min ha'avonim, v'loy min ha'ofar, v'loy min ha'mayim. How do you start a fire? Although one may use a fire in Yontif to prepare food, you may not start a fire. You may not produce a fire not from wood by rubbing 2 pieces of wood together, and not by rubbing 2 stones together, or by digging in the earth, by digging very hard into the earth and making sparks, or from water. What they would do is in those times, in the times of the Mishnayos, Amal, they would use a glass dish of water as a lens to focus the sun's rays and set something on fire. The Chacham answered starting a fire in Yantif, even for Eichel Nefesh, because one creates something entirely new, an act that is similar to Malacha. It's prohibited only to create a new flame. One may light a flame from one that's already burning. Although actual malacha is often mutter and Yom Tov for the sake of preparing food, lighting a fire is also because it can be done just as effectively before Yom Tov. And one may not heat up new unused earthenware tiles in order to roast food on them, because the first time a tile is heated, you're strengthening it by the fire, and its manufacture is thereby completed. Making utensils forbidden in Yantif, as we learned in Mishnah Dalet. So included in this Isser is performing the final step in the creation of a keli, as in the case of our Mishnah, where a person hardens tiles that have already been formed. So you're not forming the tiles, but you're just being mechazik them, just like any other keli, klicheres, and these kind of things that get stronger when they're in the fire. V'odam Rebbe Lezer, and Rebbe Lezer says another halacha, Amir Adam ala muktzah erev Shabbos v'shviyas. A person may stand to fruits that are muktzah on Friday during the Shemitah year. And he says, I'll eat from here tomorrow. By saying that he plans to eat some of the fruits, even though he didn't point to any specific ones, he has prepared them and he's allowed to eat them on Shabbos. What are we talking about over here? This refers to figs or grapes that were put out in the sun to dry. While they are drying, they're not edible. So they are muktzah because they've been set apart from use. So the Mishnah speaks of fruits that have dried to the point where some people would eat them, but others wouldn't. So the muktzah status of these fruits depends on the owner. If he shows that he intends to eat them on Shabbos or Yontif, if they're mutter, otherwise they're also. So Amir Adam al muktzah erev Shabbos b'shviyas, and he says min kana ni oichel amocha. What is shviyas? We know every 7th year is Shemitah, where it's forbidden in Eretz Yisrael to plow, plant, to do any other types of malach in the field. Any produce that grows during Shemitah is not considered the property who normally would own it, but it's rather hefker, it's ownerless. Anyone may enter a private field and take produce that's growing there. For more information, look in Masechet Shviyas and our shiurim there, which we explained at great length. All the Mishnayos there. Produce that grows in Eretz Yisrael, may not be eaten until Truma and Meiser has been separated from it. However, the chiyuv to separate Truma and Meiser doesn't begin until the produce has been processed and is ready to be eaten. Therefore, someone who leaves fruits out to dry would not separate these portions from them until the drying process was completed, since he does not intend to eat them before then. This means that drying fruit may not be eaten on Shabbos, regardless of muktzah concerns, since separating Truma and Meiser is forbidden on Shabbos. In the Shemitah year, though, there is no chiyuv to separate Truma and Meiser. So during Shemitah, if the drying fruits were not muktzah, they would be mutter to be eaten on Shabbos. For this reason, the Mishnah specifies Shemitah, since it speaks of fruits that are immediately permitted once the muktzah status is removed. The same halacha would apply in any other year to drying fruit, which was already separated Trumas and Meiser from. However, the Chachamim hold that this is not enough to remove the Isser from them. Ad sheyirsha v'yoyimar mikan ve'ad kan. The fruits are muktzah unless he makes a mark on the specific ones that he plans to eat, and he says, I will eat from here to here. The Chachamim require the owner to specify which fruits he plans to eat, and to mark them in order for them to be considered prepared for Shabbos use. Ad kan.